Do you have any recommendations for, and this might sound a little meta, but how people should think about long-term thinking or the long term? Because the recommendation for, say, an equity index or index ETFs was predicated on investing and holding for a long period of time. What would you consider sort of the minimal viable long period of time? If you have an answer to that, and how can people become more aware of their own weaknesses related to short-termism or short-term thinking and switch to more long-term?
I tend to be a long-term thinker. You might say, well, if you're 89, how can you be a long-term thinker? Well, I have children and grandchildren, and I also am feeling pretty good and staying in good shape, so 89 may not be all that old at this point. In any case, I would say that if you're looking at 15 or 20 years or more, maybe you have a dynasty trust or something like that, or you have descendants, and you yourself expect to live 15 or 20 years or more, the best investment, I think, is to buy almost entirely equities and hold it. You might want to have a little cash around, but I think Buffett recommends 90% index and 10% bonds or short-term, intermediate-term bonds for cash. That does just about as well as 100% equities. I just put it all in equities because I have enough, so I don't have to worry about fluctuations up and down. If you have a shorter time horizon, you may want to do things differently. And it depends on how much you're going to need and how much you have. I have a set of rules that are a little bit helpful here. I'll start with what I'll call the 4% rule. Suppose that you're going to retire and you want enough to last you from your capital throughout the rest of your life. I would say a pretty good working rule is to put it mostly in equities and spend 4% of your capital each year, or less if you can. And that ought to last you from, say, the 60s till the end of your life. It's not guaranteed, but pretty good chance it will. Then I have the 2% rule, which I've found by studies, both mathematical and by simulation of stock returns. If you only drain 2% out per year, then that money will probably grow in perpetuity. There's a small chance it'll be extinguished by really bad downturns, but it's very small. There is an organization that freezes people, and they asked me for advice about how to invest their endowment fund.
Freezing meaning cryogenically freezing people?
Yes. And so I said, for the endowment fund, which is going to get people out of being frozen sometime in the far future, 50, 100, 200 years out, for that fund, you're going to want to invest long-term and let it run, because that's going to get you the most money down the road. And if you're going to attempt to reanimate somebody, there's no specific timetable. If you don't have enough money to reanimate them at a certain time, you can wait a few years and let the money grow a little more. So you want money to grow to as big an amount as possible in the far future. And so the 2% rule for the endowment fund, I think, was a pretty good rule for spending, because all the simulations showed that it would grow to a very large amount over a period of time. So that's long-term thinking. Intermediate term, I think of that as maybe 5 to 15 or 20 years. And there, something like the 4% rule that I described might be good. And for short term, it's just a matter of what your needs are and what you're going to have to come up with. And people are in various ranges of wealth. There's what you might call poor, where you don't have very much to save or put aside, and you're going to be hard to retire and hard to make it. Then there may be middle-class people who can put a moderate amount away. I know somebody, for example, she has saved about $1.5 million, and she is in her mid-50s. I think she'll be fine. So I've explained to her, pile it all in equities and let it rip. She gets scared every so often when there's a downturn. And she calls me and I tell her, just hold fast. And then it goes back up. She said, I'm really glad I held fast. A lot of people are what I call scared rabbits. And when the market goes up, they get confident and they start buying. And then it drops and they get really scared at the bottom and they sell out. And then it goes back up and they buy again. And it drops and they get really scared at the bottom and they go back out again. So they seem to have the worst of it all the time.
Doesn't feel good to go through life as a scared rabbit. And it certainly hurts your financial standing.
That's where thinking for yourself comes in.
Yeah.
You won't hold fast to something unless you understand it yourself. There's an old saying, give a person a fish and they eat for a day. Teach a person to fish and they eat for a lifetime. Mm-hmm. And there's a similar thing for thinking. If you give somebody advice about a problem, they might solve that one problem. If you teach them how to think about problems, they can solve problems for the rest of their life. And so that's the way to go. And also, if you give them advice and they don't understand what the advice is or how to think about it, there's a good chance they won't take their advice.